The doors of Buckingham Palace had not opened like that in years. Polished boots struck marble with disciplined precision as a royal guard stepped forward, not for a monarch, not for a visiting head of state, but for Carole Middleton, through the sovereign's entrance. The corridor fell silent. Footmen froze mid-breath. Even the chandeliers seemed to tremble beneath the weight of what was unfolding, because that doorway is sacred, reserved for reigning authority, protected by centuries of tradition, whispered about in protocol manuals that most never see. And from the shadowed archway stood Queen Camilla, watching. Her expression did not shift, but in royal language, silence speaks louder than protest. Why was Carole Middleton being escorted through a passage meant for sovereign power? Who authorized it? And what message was being sent? Not to the public, but to the crown itself. In a monarchy where symbolism is everything, one step across a threshold can redraw invisible lines of influence. Tonight, we uncover what truly happened inside those palace walls, and why one quiet escort changed the balance of royal power forever. The palace had been awake for hours, though the sun had only just begun to stretch pale gold across the skyline of Buckingham Palace. Inside its limestone walls, discipline moved like clockwork. Polished shoes gliding across marble, hushed briefings exchanged beneath chandeliers that had witnessed 3 centuries of measured power. And yet, on this particular morning, something shifted. It began with the echo. Not hurried, not uncertain. The echo of boots on marble, deliberate, ceremonial, resonant. The kind of sound that did not merely announce movement, but authority. The camera would drift first toward the archway, the sovereign's entrance. A doorway not meant for convenience, not meant for symbolism alone. It was reserved exclusively for the reigning monarch, for moments of state gravity, for arrivals that defined eras. Above the arch, carved deep into stone, the royal cipher shimmered faintly in the early light. The gilded detailing had been restored only months prior. It was immaculate, untouched by controversy, untouched by compromise. Until now, the doors opened inward. 2 members of the royal guard emerged first. Scarlet tunics, cut with military precision, medals aligned with mathematical accuracy. Their faces did not betray emotion. They were trained not to. Between them walked a woman who did not wear a crown. Carole Middleton, mother of the Princess of Wales. A figure long present on the periphery of history. Supportive, composed, careful. Never demanding visibility. Never seeking ceremonial prominence. And yet here she was, escorted to the sovereign's entrance. A senior footman, midway through adjusting floor arrangements in the grand corridor, froze. A junior aide carrying briefing folders slowed to a near halt. Even the quiet rhythm of domestic staff seemed to falter. No one spoke, because no one needed to. This door was not a corridor. It was a declaration. The camera would linger, not on faces, but on details. The polished marble floor, reflecting the scarlet of the guard's uniform. The glint of insignias. The faint tremor of chandeliers stirred by air displacement as the doors sealed behind them. Carole's posture remained dignified, restrained. She did not rush. She did not hesitate. Her navy ensemble was understated, tailored, respectful of setting. A pearl brooch caught a thread of morning light, subtle, deliberate. She was not trespassing. She had been escorted, which meant one thing, authorization. But what followed next would ripple far beyond the corridor. Hours earlier, deep within the administrative wing of the palace, a clearance code had been amended. No announcement, no press advisory, no ceremonial docket issued to the public record. Just a line of protocol, adjusted. In a monarchy built on centuries of structured hierarchy, amendments do not occur casually. They require signatures, counter-signatures, verification chains that pass through private secretaries, chamberlains, and, ultimately, the sovereign's authority. Someone had approved this, and someone had done so quietly. Meanwhile, from a shadowed corridor overlooking the quadrangle, a figure observed. Queen Camilla stood partially concealed behind a column of pale stone. Her expression, as always, was composed, sculpted by decades of scrutiny. Her gaze did not follow the guards. It rested instead upon the doorway itself, the sovereign's entrance. She understood its language. She understood that entrances speak before words ever do. For a brief moment, the faintest tightening touched her jaw. Not anger, not shock, recognition. She turned without summoning an attendant. Silence can be instruction. Inside the grand vestibule, Carole was greeted not by applause nor by ceremony, but by protocol officers who bowed with measured precision. "Good morning, Mrs. Middleton," the senior officer said, voice even, respectful. No one stumbled over formality. The address was exact. The escort did not waver. The camera would shift upward, tracing the gilded ceiling murals depicting sovereigns past. Queen Elizabeth II had passed through this entrance on state occasions. Visiting presidents had paused beneath its arch heads of Commonwealth realms, had waited at its threshold. History lingered in the air like incense. And now, without announcement, a new presence had crossed it. Carole's expression revealed little, yet her eyes, steady and perceptive, absorbed everything. She was not naive to symbolism. Years within royal proximity had educated her in subtleties most citizens would never perceive. She knew this was not incidental. The escort continued toward the interior corridor, leading to a private audience chamber. Footsteps echoed, disciplined, symmetrical. Behind closed doors, conversations had already begun. In the staff antechamber, whispers moved carefully, never loud enough to be traced. Was this scheduled? It must have been cleared. But through that entrance, each question was less accusation and more astonishment, because the sovereign's entrance was more than stone and brass. It was hierarchy made architectural. Across the courtyard, the Prince and Princess of Wales had not yet been informed. Their morning schedule involved charitable briefings and educational patronage discussions. Routine, steady, public, but routine inside palace walls can fracture without warning. A private equerry approached with discreet urgency. Papers were exchanged. A subtle nod. Nothing dramatic. Yet tension threaded the air. Inside the princess's office, a pause settled. Carole's motherly presence in royal life had always been stabilizing, a bridge between common origin and institutional expectation. She had never sought precedence, which is precisely why this moment unsettled observers. Was it recognition, or was it strategy? The camera would cut back to the corridor, where Queen Camilla now walked alone. Her heels struck marble with quiet authority. An equerry approached, cautious. "Your Majesty, shall I inquire?" "No," she replied gently. One word. Controlled. She continued walking. The power of silence is often underestimated. But within monarchy, silence is language. By mid-morning, the palace had resumed its rhythm, outwardly unchanged. Yet beneath the surface, calculations unfolded. Who signed the amendment? The captain of the guard confirmed compliance with procedural code. The escort had been executed with full authorization clearance. No breach, no impropriety, which made it more consequential. Improvised actions can be dismissed. Authorized ones cannot. Hours later, in a private administrative office lined with leather-bound ceremonial manuals, a junior equerry re-examined the digital ledger. The timestamp glowed quietly on the screen. Authorization updated. 6:14 a.m. Countersigned. The signature code corresponded not to a mid-level official, but to the king's private secretary. The room seemed to contract. This had not been accidental. It had ascended to the highest channel of approval. Late afternoon light slanted across palace windows, casting elongated shadows across the quadrangle. Carole's meeting concluded without spectacle. She exited through a secondary corridor, not the sovereign's entrance. Protocol remained intact on departure, but the message had already been delivered. As her car departed through the gates, journalists outside sensed nothing unusual. No headlines would print that evening. No official communique would clarify. Yet inside those walls, recalibration had begun. In her private sitting room, Queen Camilla paused before an ancestral portrait. Monarchy evolves in increments, not declarations. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass. Visibility, she understood, is legitimacy. And legitimacy in royal life is measured not by affection, but by recognition. Across the palace, staff finalized daily reports. The amended authorization was archived, filed, preserved in institutional memory. Because even small gestures become precedent. Night settled slowly over London. The sovereign's entrance stood closed once more, stone unmoved, cipher gleaming faintly under courtyard lamps. To an outsider, it was merely a door. But within these walls, entrances define order. They define who is seen. They define who is acknowledged. And sometimes they redefine balance itself. The echo of those morning footsteps lingered long after the marble fell silent. Because in royal life, power rarely announces itself loudly. It arrives with precision and leaves with implication. The echo of that morning had not faded. By the time dusk settled over Buckingham Palace, the sovereign's entrance stood closed once more, still, dignified, immovable. Yet within administrative corridors and private offices, its meaning was being quietly dissected. The courtyard was silent now, but the implications of that escort lingered in the air like a question no one wished to ask aloud. Because in royal life, protocol is not suggestion. It is law, written in gold leaf and centuries of memory. And someone had adjusted it. The camera would drift through a lesser-seen wing of the palace, away from chandeliers and state portraits, into the archive rooms where ceremonial manuals are preserved with the reverence of sacred texts. Leather-bound volumes lined the shelves. Their spines bore dates that predated electricity. Inside, calligraphy detailed procedures for entrances, curtsies, procession orders, and seating hierarchies at banquets attended by emperors. The sovereign's entrance had its own chapter, reserved exclusively for the reigning monarch, consorts accompanying the monarch, visiting heads of state granted equivalent ceremonial rank, no mention of extended family, no clause referencing in-laws. The ink was clear, yet history had taught palace officials one immutable truth. Written protocol could be amended, but only with authority of the highest order. And so, the investigation did not begin with suspicion. It began with verification. In a quiet operations room overlooking the quadrangle, the captain of the guard reviewed the morning's escort log. His posture was exact. His expression, disciplined neutrality. Authorization code verified at 614, he confirmed to a small cluster of senior aides. Escorted clearance level, sovereign tier ceremonial access. He paused, not for effect, but for precision, executed without deviation. No breach, no improvisation. The escort had followed textbook procedure, which meant the significance lay not in the execution, but in the permission. Meanwhile, in a separate wing, administrative staff reopened digital clearance records. Screens glowed against dimmed lights. Timestamp metadata blinked in quiet defiance of denial. Authorization amended. 6:14 a.m. Previous status, standard family access via garden entrance. Amended by Office of the King's Private Secretary. The room grew heavier, because within palace hierarchy, the private secretary is not a mere administrator. He is the sovereign's institutional voice, the architect of schedule, clearance, and strategic symbolism. Nothing bearing his countersignature is casual. The camera would cut to a long corridor lined with portraits, sovereigns from centuries past. Among them, the composed image of Queen Elizabeth II seemed almost observational, her painted gaze calm yet penetrating. Under her reign, ceremonial adjustments had occurred, but rarely without public framing. She understood optics. She understood continuity, which raised a question now echoing through present corridors. Why this gesture, and why in silence? In the Prince and Princess of Wales office suite, a more personal dimension unfolded. Catherine, Princess of Wales, listened carefully as her private secretary relayed the morning's development. She did not react with visible shock. Years within royal life had trained her to process symbolism quietly. Her mother had not requested prominence. That much she knew with certainty. Carole Middleton's strength had always been discretion, presence without intrusion. Was there prior consultation? Catherine asked softly. None recorded, Your Royal Highness. A pause followed. Not tension, but contemplation. Because this was not about familial pride. It was about institutional message. Across the room, Prince William stood near a window overlooking the gardens. His expression was thoughtful, measured. He understood architecture of power. He understood that gestures within the palace often serve multiple audiences, internal, public, and historical. Who initiated the amendment? He asked quietly. The counter's signature traces to the king's private secretary, sir. William nodded once. No visible emotion, but the realization settled with gravity. This was sanctioned from above. Elsewhere, Queen Camilla's private office remained deliberately undisturbed. Queen Camilla sat at a writing desk positioned beneath tall, sash windows. Light filtered through gauze curtains, softening the severity of carved oak panels. A briefing folder lay unopened at her side. She had not issued objection. She had not sought clarification. Within royal dynamics, silence can serve many purposes: restraint, dignity, strategy. But silence is never neutral. An equerry approached cautiously. Your Majesty, shall we request formal clarification? Camilla's gaze lifted. Steady. Clarification implies confusion, she replied calmly. And there is none. The answer carried weight not because of its volume, but because of its composure. As evening progressed, debate sharpened, though never publicly. In a council room rarely shown to cameras, senior household officials gathered around a polished mahogany table. The discussion was clinical, not emotional. Precedent. One advisor noted, fingers steepled. If extended family elders receive sovereign tier access, ceremonial hierarchy must reflect consistency. Is this elevation permanent? Another asked. Or symbolic for a single engagement? No one possessed definitive answers, because the paperwork revealed only amendment, not intent. And intent in monarchy is everything. Hours later, in the administrative archive, a junior equerry, meticulous, observant, reopened the digital ledger once more. Something had been overlooked. The original clearance had been submitted the previous evening. Routine access via garden entrance. But at 6:14 a.m., precisely 46 minutes before palace gates opened, the entry was amended. 46 minutes. That window suggested urgency, not long-term planning. A decision made at dawn. The equerry's breath slowed, because dawn decisions often emerge from private deliberations the night before, and private deliberations often follow sensitive conversations. The camera would drift outside now, to the illuminated facade of Buckingham Palace under evening sky. Tourists gathered beyond gates, unaware of recalibration unfolding within. For them, monarchy appeared constant. Marble, ceremony, waving standards. But inside, tradition is not static. It is curated, adjusted, protected. The next morning, the captain of the guard submitted a supplementary memo, not questioning the order, but documenting its execution for historical record. Because in this institution, even silence is archived. The memo described escort formation, timing precision, absence of deviation, witness compliance, every detail preserved. History, after all, is written by those who file it correctly. Meanwhile, in private quarters, Carole Middleton resumed her quiet routine. Charitable correspondence, family commitments, domestic normalcy far removed from palace marble. There was no triumphant reflection, no celebration. If she felt the weight of that entrance, she did not display it, which made the gesture more enigmatic. Was it recognition of her stabilizing influence? An acknowledgement of maternal legacy shaping the future queen? Or a calculated signal to reinforce unity during a period of public scrutiny? The answers remained carefully unspoken. By midday, speculation had settled into institutional focus. One senior advisor articulated the underlying truth. In monarchy, we do not move doors lightly. The phrase lingered, because doors represent thresholds. Thresholds represent progression, and progression must be controlled. Late afternoon brought a final discovery. The junior equerry, still unsettled by the timing discrepancy, traced the amendment's routing path through internal system logs. The request had originated not from Carole's liaison office, not from the Wales household, but from within the king's private scheduling unit. Direct channel. High clearance. The equerry leaned back slowly. This had not been reactive. It had been deliberate. And deliberate gestures in monarchy are rarely isolated. They signal narrative. They anticipate reaction. They test equilibrium. As the sun dipped behind the palace facade, Queen Camilla walked once more through a quiet corridor lined with ancestral portraits. Her reflection followed her in polished glass frames. She paused briefly before a portrait of a former consort, a woman whose legitimacy had once been questioned, whose presence had required careful navigation through public and private scrutiny. Camilla understood endurance. She understood visibility. She also understood that recognition within monarchy is earned not merely through time, but through placement. Placement at doors, placement at events, placement in processions. And someone had shifted placement, without spectacle, without announcement, without explanation. That evening, a single line was added to the internal ceremonial registry. Extended family elder, sovereign tier entrance clearance authorized under discretionary unity clause. The clause itself was obscure, rarely invoked, buried deep within procedural annexes. But now it carried contemporary relevance, because unity, when invoked by a king, becomes strategic. Night fell completely over London. The palace exterior glowed softly against the darkness. Inside, order appeared restored. But beneath the restoration lay subtle transformation. No press statement would announce it. No commentator would debate it. Yet those who understood royal architecture recognized the shift. The sovereign's entrance had been used not merely as passage, but as punctuation, a quiet mark in the evolving grammar of monarchy. And just as silence had followed the escort, another silence now settled, heavier, more anticipatory, because one final truth had surfaced. The authorization had been amended only hours before dawn, which meant someone, somewhere within those walls, had changed their mind, suddenly, deliberately, and perhaps in response to something unseen. The palace did not tremble. It never does. By the third morning after the escort, routine had resumed with almost surgical precision. Carriages entered and exited through expected gates. Footmen adjusted cuffs beneath ancestral portraits. Schedules were honored down to the minute. And yet, beneath the discipline, something watched. The sovereign's entrance remained closed, immaculate, undisturbed, but its silence felt different now, like a door aware of what it had permitted. Meanwhile, within her private sitting room overlooking the inner gardens of Buckingham Palace, Queen Camilla sat alone. Morning light pooled across the carpet in long rectangles. A silver tea service rested untouched beside her. She was not reading. She was considering. The escort itself had been executed flawlessly. No breach of discipline. No procedural misstep. The guard had acted with textbook composure, which meant the question was no longer about how. It was about why. Her private secretary stood a respectful distance away, hands clasped. The amendment originated from the king's scheduling office, Your Majesty, he said quietly, countersigned through proper channels. Camilla's expression did not shift, and the discretionary clause? Invoked under unity provisions, rarely used. A faint nod. Unity. It was a word that carried both comfort and caution inside monarchy. Unity could stabilize. It could also reposition. She rose slowly and walked toward the tall windows. Outside, the quadrangle gleamed in careful symmetry. Have there been internal objections? She asked. None formally expressed. Of course not. In royal institutions, objections are rarely voiced outright. They are measured in glances, in seating charts, in the subtle choreography of who stands where and who does not. Across the palace, in the Wales private office suite, a parallel conversation unfolded. Prince William stood beside a fireplace that had burned for generations of heirs before him. His posture was calm, but the weight in his gaze suggested calculation rather than comfort. Opposite him sat Catherine, Princess of Wales, her composure unwavering, though her fingers rested thoughtfully against the arm of her chair. This cannot appear divisive, Catherine said softly. It must not be, William replied. They both understood the fragility of perception. The public sees unity as stability. Any suggestion of rivalry within palace walls could fracture confidence far beyond ceremonial corridors. My mother would never request such recognition, Catherine added. William nodded once, which may be precisely why it was granted. The statement lingered between them. Recognition given unrequested can signal appreciation, or it can test reaction. But what followed next shifted the tone from curiosity to tension. A confidential note circulated among senior courtiers, not accusatory, not inflammatory, but observant. It questioned whether the escort had been symbolic of maternal acknowledgement in anticipation of future constitutional shifts. The phrase was careful. Future constitutional shifts. Inside monarchy, that phrase points toward only one reality, succession, the watching crown. Camilla had endured decades of scrutiny to secure her position. Her path had not been conventional, nor without public resistance. Legitimacy had been earned through persistence, restraint, and alignment with duty. Now, as queen consort, she understood the invisible geometry of recognition better than most. And geometry was shifting. The camera would follow her through a corridor lined with portraits of former consorts, women whose influence varied in volume but whose presence had defined eras. Camilla paused before one portrait in particular. The frame's gilded edges caught morning light. She did not speak, but her reflection overlapped the painted figure, past and present occupying the same visual plane. Power within monarchy is rarely seized. It is conferred, and sometimes it is redistributed through symbols rather than speeches. Midday brought the first private exchange between Camilla and the king's private secretary. They met not in the grand audience chamber, but in a smaller study lined with leather-bound constitutional volumes. Was this discussed at length? Camilla asked evenly. Yes, Your Majesty. An intent? To reinforce unity during a delicate period. Public scrutiny remains high. The gesture was deemed stabilizing. Stabilizing. The word carried strategic clarity. Yet it also implied that something required stabilization. Was there consultation with the whales? She asked. Indirectly, through scheduling channels. A pause. Not anger. Not confrontation. But awareness. Because indirect consultation can be interpreted as inclusion or exclusion. Meanwhile, outside the palace gates, the public remained unaware. Tourists posed for photographs. Flags fluttered against London's pale sky. The monarchy, to the outside eye, was steady as ever. But inside, moral questions sharpened. Is recognition of a future queen's mother a natural evolution of modern monarchy? Or does it risk diluting the clarity of hierarchical boundaries? And if the king himself authorized a gesture, does questioning it undermine sovereign authority? These questions moved quietly through drawing rooms and briefing papers. No raised voices, just measured deliberation. In the early evening, a more intimate conversation unfolded between William and Camilla. It was not adversarial. It was precise. They met in a private drawing room where portraits of ancestors watched from ornate frames. William spoke first. There is no intention of overshadowing, ma'am. Camilla regarded him carefully. I have never assumed there was. Silence stretched. But symbols carry weight, she continued, and weight must be distributed with care. William inclined his head. We agree. The exchange was brief, but beneath its civility lay generational awareness. The future stood before the present. The present defended continuity. Neither sought conflict, but both understood that evolution must be choreographed. Hours later, the junior equerry who had first noticed a time-stamped irregularity uncovered one final detail. The amendment request had been preceded by a closed-door conversation the previous evening between the king and his private secretary. Duration, 43 minutes. Topic, not recorded. Within monarchy, unrecorded conversations are not unusual, but when followed by dawn amendments to ceremonial protocol, they gain significance. The equerry closed the file slowly. This had not been reactive. It had been strategic. The emotional midpoint arrived quietly. In her private quarters, Camilla sat alone once more. The palace had grown hushed. The ticking of an antique clock filled the room. She did not resent Carole Middleton. Resentment has little place in institutions that endure centuries. But she understood perception. If recognition expands without clarity, hierarchy blurs. And blurred hierarchy invites instability. She rose and walked toward her writing desk. A single document lay prepared. A request, not for reversal, but for audience. A private audience with the king. Because questions of symbolism must be addressed not in corridors, but face to face. Meanwhile, Carole Middleton remained unaware of the internal calculus her brief walk had triggered. She had returned to her home, resumed routine, answered correspondence with steady humility. Her composure was not strategy. It was character, which perhaps made the gesture even more powerful. Recognition bestowed upon those who do not seek it carries moral resonance. And moral resonance reshapes narrative. The camera would drift once more to the sovereign's entrance, closed, unmoved, yet forever altered by the memory of that morning. Because architecture remembers, and so do institutions. The next day, confirmation arrived. A private audience had been scheduled. Location, a small chamber adjacent to staterooms. Attendees, the king, the queen consort. No aides, no recorders. When doors close at that level, outcomes are rarely trivial. As the sun dipped behind the facade of Buckingham Palace, tension settled not as fear, but as anticipation. Hierarchy would meet hierarchy. Intent would meet interpretation. And symbolism would demand explanation. Because the watching crown does not react impulsively. It observes. It measures. It decides. And what would be said behind those doors might redefine not just one entrance, but the architecture of recognition itself. The corridor outside the audience chamber was empty. No aides. No footman. No rustle of paperwork. Just stillness. The palace had learned long ago that certain conversations required architectural silence. And on this afternoon, within the inner rooms of Buckingham Palace, silence was deliberate. The doors closed with muted finality. Inside, the room was smaller than the staterooms, more intimate, lined with ancestral portraits whose varnished surfaces caught the low winter light. A fire burned softly in the hearth, its quiet crackle the only sound not shaped by restraint. King Charles III stood near the mantel, hands lightly clasped behind his back. His posture was not defensive, nor imposing, but contemplative. Across from him, Queen Camilla took her seat without haste. There were no formal greetings beyond the expected nod, because this was not ceremony. This was clarity. For a moment, neither spoke. The camera would rest on small details, the flicker of firelight against gold frames, the faint ticking of an antique clock, the weight of centuries watching from painted canvases. Finally, Camilla broke the silence. The sovereign's entrance, she said evenly. It is not a threshold we move lightly. Charles did not immediately answer. I am aware, he replied after a measured pause. His tone carried neither apology nor defiance, only acknowledgement. And yet it was moved, she continued, quietly, at dawn. The words were not accusatory. They were observational. Charles turned slightly, meeting her gaze. It was not moved, he said gently. It was extended. A subtle distinction. Extension suggests inclusion. Movement suggests displacement. But in institutions built on precedents, even extension alters geometry. He stepped toward a small writing desk where a folder lay open. I authorize amendment, he said plainly. After careful consideration, there was no attempt at concealment. Camilla inclined her head once, absorbing the admission without visible reaction. May I ask, she said softly, what consideration compelled urgency at 6:14 in the morning? A faint breath passed between them, almost a smile, but not quite, because, Charles answered, unity delayed becomes unity denied. The fire shifted in the hearth. Outside the chamber walls, the palace remained in motion. Staff crossing corridors, guards adjusting positions, schedules proceeding without deviation. But inside this room, time slowed. Charles continued, we are navigating a period of scrutiny. Public confidence must be strengthened not by proclamation, but by alignment. He paused. Carole Middleton represents stability to the future generation. She represents continuity between ordinary life and royal duty, recognizing that publicly, even subtly, reinforces a structure we are preparing to pass forward. Camilla listened without interruption. And my position within that structure? She asked, her voice steady. Is secure, he replied. Firmly. The answer came without hesitation. Yet monarchy is not sustained by assurance alone. It is sustained by placement. Visibility equates to legitimacy, Camilla said quietly. I have learned that through endurance. Charles's expression softened, not in concession, but in understanding. And you have earned yours, he said, through loyalty, restraint, and service. A silence followed. Heavier now, layered with history neither needed to recount aloud. The emotional midpoint arrived not in raised voices, but in vulnerability. Camilla rose from her seat and walked toward a portrait of a former queen consort whose life had unfolded under relentless scrutiny. I have never sought to eclipse, she said quietly, nor to obstruct evolution. But symbolism without clarity invites interpretation. Charles joined her near the portrait. Clarity sometimes emerges only after the gesture, he replied. She turned toward him fully. And if interpretation fractures instead of fortifies, he considered the question with visible care. Then we correct it, he said simply. Not through spectacle, through refinement. Refinement, the monarchy's preferred instrument of adjustment. Hours earlier, in a separate wing of the palace, discussions had already anticipated this meeting. Senior aides debated possible outcomes. Would the Queen request formal review of the discretionary clause? Would the King issue a clarifying statement? Would ceremonial precedents be amended permanently? Yet here, behind closed doors, the tone was not combative. It was introspective, because neither sought confrontation. Both sought continuity. Charles moved back toward the desk and lifted a single document. It was never about Carole personally, he said. It was about reinforcing familial unity during a moment when speculation threatens cohesion. He placed the document gently on the table between them, a draft notation, a formal registry entry redefining ceremonial access for non-royal family elders under specific unity provisions. Not an elevation, not a demotion, a categorization. Camilla studied it carefully. The language was deliberate, precise enough to prevent ambiguity, restrained enough to avoid public controversy. You intend to formalize this, she observed. Yes. And if I object? Charles met her gaze without flinching. Then we revisit the language. Not the principle. The language. The distinction was subtle, yet decisive. The fire had burned lower now, embers glowing faintly against darkened logs. Camilla exhaled slowly. I do not object to unity, she said. I object to uncertainty. Charles nodded once. Then let us remove uncertainty. He reached for a pen. The camera would close in on the nib as it hovered briefly above parchment, a moment suspended between decision and permanence. Because once entered into registry, ceremonial precedence does not vanish easily. It becomes record, and record becomes tradition. Elsewhere in the palace, whispers had quieted. Staff sensed that resolution was near. The junior equerry who had traced the amendment logs waited anxiously for outcome, not from curiosity, but from professional duty. Protocol must be documented accurately. In the Wales suite, William and Catherine maintained deliberate composure. They would not intrude upon sovereign deliberation. Their role was patience. Carole Middleton remained unaware of the gravity her presence had carried, and perhaps that, too, was intentional. Back in the chamber, Camilla stepped closer to the desk. I will not stand in opposition to unity, she said at last, but I ask for one assurance. Charles listened. That recognition must never overshadow the crown itself. The institution must remain singular. It will, he said firmly. That is my responsibility. She studied his expression, measuring conviction against consequence. Satisfied, or perhaps resigned to the inevitability of evolution, she inclined her head. Then formalize it, she said, not in defeat, in agreement. The pen touched paper. Ink settled into parchment fibers, dark, irreversible. A formal notation entered into palace registry redefining ceremonial precedents for non-royal family elders under discretionary unity clauses. It did not elevate Carole Middleton to royal rank. It did not alter succession, but it acknowledged influence. And in monarchy, acknowledgement shapes narrative as powerfully as decree. As the document dried, Charles closed the folder. It will remain discreet, he said. Camilla gave a faint, knowing smile. Discretion, she replied, is the monarchy's most durable currency. The two stood in silence once more, not adversaries, but custodians of an institution older than either of them. Outside, evening shadows lengthened across the quadrangle. The palace exhaled. Order had not been disrupted. It had been recalibrated. When the doors opened again, no announcement accompanied their parting. No press statement. No visible tension. Camilla returned to her private quarters with measured steps. Charles resumed scheduled briefings. To observers beyond palace gates, nothing had changed. But inside the registry ledger, a line of ink now existed that had not existed before. And lines of ink endure longer than whispers. That evening, Camilla appeared briefly at a charitable reception. Poised, composed, radiant under chandelier light. Her presence communicated stability. Not competition. Not insecurity. Stability. Across the room, courtiers noted the visual message with quiet relief. The monarchy had not fractured. It had adapted. Night settled once more over London. The sovereign's entrance stood closed, unchanged in stone yet transformed in meaning. It remained reserved for monarchs. But under unity provisions, acknowledgement could now extend beyond bloodline, into influence. Inside her private chamber, Camilla removed her brooch and placed it carefully upon a velvet tray. Her reflection in the mirror revealed neither triumph nor defeat, only endurance. Because power within monarchy is not defined by who walks first through a door. It is defined by who ensures the door remains worthy of walking through. And tonight, the door remained intact, refined, redefined. By morning, the palace had regained its familiar rhythm. The fountains in the quadrangle moved with measured grace. Footmen resumed their silent choreography. The sovereign's entrance stood closed beneath pale London light. Unchanged in structure, yet quietly transformed in meaning. The registry notation had been entered, the ink had dried, and now, refinement would move from parchment to presence. Inside the administrative wing of Buckingham Palace, senior aides gathered around a long mahogany table. Before them lay a carefully drafted palace bulletin, brief, restrained, intentional. No reference to controversy, no mention of amendment. Only language of unity. Updated ceremonial guidance affirms the recognition of family elders who provide enduring support to crown, reinforcing continuity and shared duty. Every word had been weighed, because monarchy does not correct itself with spectacle. It recalibrates through tone. The bulletin would not dominate headlines. It was not designed to. It would appear among routine updates, engagements, charitable patronages, seasonal messages. But for those who understood the architecture of royal life, the subtext would be unmistakable. Stability, continuity, shared legacy, and above all, equilibrium. In her private office suite, Queen Camilla reviewed the draft before its release. Her expression revealed nothing beyond quiet concentration. Balanced, she said simply. Her private secretary nodded. There was no need for further elaboration. The language neither elevated nor diminished. It clarified. Camilla closed the folder and stood. Moments later, she stepped into a waiting car bound for a Literacy Foundation engagement across the city. As cameras flashed upon her arrival, she moved with composed assurance, greeting volunteers, accepting flowers, speaking warmly of education and service. Her message was visual. Composure equals legitimacy, and legitimacy, when maintained with dignity, requires no defense. Meanwhile, within another wing of the palace, King Charles III prepared remarks for an upcoming environmental reception. His speech draft lay open on a carved desk, fountain pen resting nearby. He paused before one particular line. Service, he read softly, is not measured by title alone, but by the quiet devotion that strengthens the generations to come. The sentence would pass unnoticed by many, but within palace walls, its meaning resonated. He underlined nothing. He removed nothing. He allowed the words to remain, because subtle affirmation often carries more weight than formal decree. Across the courtyard, in the Wales suite, Prince William and Catherine, Princess of Wales reviewed their own engagement schedules. The palace bulletin had reached them moments earlier. Catherine read it once, then again, not searching for tension, but for tone. It's careful, she said quietly. William nodded. As it should be. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph, only relief, because public unity had been preserved. and private understanding had been reached without fracture. Catherine's thoughts drifted briefly to her mother, steadfast, unassuming, never seeking prominence. Recognition had come not through request, but through institutional acknowledgement. That distinction mattered. Elsewhere, far from Palace Marble, Carole Middleton resumed her routine. Morning tea, correspondence, a walk through familiar countryside air. The Palace Bulletin reached her through standard channels. Formal, measured. She read it without visible reaction. Recognition, when unexpected, can feel heavier than ambition, but she carried it lightly. Her role had never been to occupy ceremonial foreground. It had been to steady the foundation, and foundations rarely demand spotlight. By late afternoon, the ripple of speculation that had once stirred palace corridors began to settle. Senior courtiers adjusted seating charts with quiet efficiency. Procession orders were refined to reflect the updated guidance, precise, orderly, dignified. Nothing dramatic, just alignment, because justice within monarchy is not punitive. It is architectural. It ensures that every placement supports the structure as a whole. The camera will return once more to the sovereign's entrance. Its carved cipher gleamed beneath the sky, now clearing after days of muted tension. The door had not been diminished. It had been contextualized. Its exclusivity remained intact, reserved for sovereign authority. Yet unity provisions had allowed symbolic inclusion under specific circumstance. Balance. That was the word echoing through corridors now. Balance between tradition and evolution, between hierarchy and acknowledgement, between silence and statement. That evening, at the environmental reception, King Charles delivered his prepared remarks beneath chandeliers that cast soft gold across assembled guests. When he reached the line about quiet devotion strengthening generations, his voice did not waver. Legacy, he continued, is not sustained by prominence alone. It is sustained by those who stand beside the future with constancy. Applause followed, polite, respectful. No one outside the palace walls connected the words to a door used days before. But inside, the message was clear. Unity had been reinforced not through conflict, but through refinement. Later that night, Queen Camilla attended a separate engagement, a small reception honoring community volunteers. She listened more than she spoke. She moved through the room with deliberate warmth. And when a young volunteer asked what sustains a monarchy through changing times, Camilla paused before answering. Duty, she said simply, and the understanding that no role exists in isolation. It was not a rehearsed response. It was lived truth, because in recent days, isolation had been avoided. Division had been sidestepped, and dignity had prevailed. Back inside Buckingham Palace, the final administrative adjustments were completed. The registry entry sat preserved among centuries of ceremonial documentation. Future historians might one day notice it, a brief notation expanding unity provisions. They might analyze its context. But for now, it served its purpose. It restored equilibrium. Near midnight, Camilla stood alone in a quiet corridor, gazing briefly toward the direction of the sovereign's entrance. She did not approach it. She did not need to. Its symbolism no longer felt uncertain. It had been tested, and the institution had responded with composure. Across the palace grounds, lights dimmed one by one. Order, once questioned, now felt settled. Not rigid, not threatened. Settled. Because monarchy survives not by resisting change outright, but by guiding it carefully within established walls. And on this occasion, guidance had prevailed. The next morning dawned clear over London. Tourists gathered beyond palace gates, unaware that history, in its quietest form, had unfolded days before. To them, the monarchy appeared as it always had. Steadfast, ceremonial, unshaken, which was precisely the point. Within royal life, true resolution leaves no visible scar. It restores symmetry so seamlessly that tension seems imagined. Yet those who walk palace corridors know the truth. Entrances matter. Symbols endure. And when balance is threatened, it is restored not with noise, but with refinement. The palace is quiet at dawn, before the briefings begin, before the gates open, before the measured choreography of monarchy resumes its daily rhythm. In those early hours, Buckingham Palace feels less like an institution and more like a monument to memory. Stone holds a night's coolness. Corridors rest. Even the chandeliers seem suspended in thought. And there, facing the inner quadrangle, stands the sovereign's entrance, unmoved, unadorned beyond its cipher. Yet now, forever marked by meaning, the escort had lasted minutes, the debate days, the symbolism enduring, because in a monarchy, architecture is not passive. It instructs, it defines, it signals to those inside and outside the invisible boundaries of authority. Doors, in particular, speak. They tell you who enters first, who waits, who is acknowledged, who is honored, and sometimes who is trusted. That morning when Carole Middleton walked beside the guard, she did not step ahead of the crown. She did not claim space that was not hers. She walked beside discipline, beside history, beside expectation, and the institution absorbed it. The camera would rise slowly above the courtyard, the symmetrical gravel, the precise geometry of windows, the silent guards positioned in ritual stillness. Monarchy survives on geometry. Lines must remain clear. Hierarchy must remain legible. But clarity does not mean rigidity. Over centuries, the British crown has evolved not by dismantling its doors, but by redefining who may pass through them and under what understanding. From coronations to wartime addresses, from private grief to public jubilee, the architecture has remained constant while meaning has shifted. That is its strength. Inside a private study, King Charles III reviews correspondence beneath soft lamplight. His reign, still young in historical terms, carries the weight of continuity and adaptation in equal measure. He understands that gestures often speak louder than declarations. A speech may inspire for a day. A symbol may endure for decades. The decision to extend ceremonial acknowledgement under unity provisions was not dramatic. It was not revolutionary. It was incremental, but increments accumulate. And history often turns not on grand confrontations, but on quiet recalibrations. Elsewhere in the palace, Queen Camilla moves through a corridor lined with portraits of former consorts. She pauses briefly, as she often does, not in comparison, not in competition, but in contemplation. Her journey to this place was neither linear nor universally embraced. Legitimacy, for her, was not inherited overnight. It was built through patience, resilience, and disciplined silence. She knows what it means to stand beside power without overshadowing it. She knows that respect is not seized. It is conferred gradually through constancy. And perhaps that is why the sovereign's entrance did not threaten her. It reminded her, power in monarchy is not defined by who walks ahead. It is defined by who ensures the institution remains worthy of walking into. Across London, life unfolds without awareness of registry entries or dawn amendments. Buses move past the palace gates. Tourists lift their cameras. Children point at the guards in scarlet tunics. The crown appears immovable, which is precisely why its smallest movements matter most. Because stability is not the absence of change. It is the careful management of it. The narrative returns once more to Carole Middleton. She has resumed her quiet rhythm. Family gatherings, charitable commitments, the steady dignity of private life intertwined with public consequence. She did not seek ceremony. She did not request recognition. She walked when escorted, and then she stepped back. There's a lesson in that restraint. In modern monarchy, influence is no longer confined strictly to bloodline. It radiates outward, through those who shape future generations, who anchor them in normalcy, who remind heirs that humanity precedes hierarchy, acknowledging that influence does not weaken the crown. It contextualizes it. The sovereign's entrance remains exclusive, reserved, symbolic, but its recent use revealed something subtle yet profound. Tradition can expand without eroding. Authority can adapt without dissolving. Unity can be expressed without proclamation. The monarchy did not fracture over a doorway. It refined itself. In the Wales residence, Prince William stands a window overlooking gardens that will one day fall under his stewardship as sovereign. Beside him, Catherine, Princess of Wales, reviews briefing notes for an upcoming engagement. Their future is inevitable, but inevitability requires preparation. The quiet recognition of Catherine's mother was not coronation. It was context, a signal that the future queen's foundation is acknowledged, not hidden. In centuries past, such acknowledgement might have been unthinkable. Today, it reflects evolution, not rebellion. The emotional resolution of this story lies not in confrontation avoided, but in understanding achieved. Camilla did not demand reversal. Charles did not dismiss concern. William did not escalate tension. Each fulfilled their role within the structure the institution held, not because conflict never existed, but because discipline outweighed ego. The camera returns one final time to the sovereign's entrance. Evening now. Lights glow softly against stone. The cipher gleams faintly beneath lamplight. A single guard stands watch, motionless, precise. The echo of that morning's footsteps has long faded. Yet, meaning lingers. Because in the world of crowns and corridors, power is rarely loud. It is architectural. It is procedural. It is encoded in who stands where and why. The escort was brief. The debate was contained. The registry entry was discreet. But the lesson endures. In monarchy, loyalty is not proven through dominance, but through discipline. Respect is not demanded through proximity, but earned through restraint. And power is not defined by walking at a crown, but by knowing when to walk beside it. As the palace settles once more into night, calm and composed beneath the London sky, the sovereign's entrance stands as it always has, a threshold between tradition and evolution, a door that does not move easily. But when it does, it signals more than arrival. It signals intention. And intention within monarchy shapes history.